Eric Greela, General, says at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing that the U.S. is seeing an increase recently in unprofessional and unsafe behavior of the Russian Air Forces, end of quote. State Department yesterday suggested, though, that the downing of the drone was likely not intentional on the Russian side. Can you help us understand what most likely happened and assess the rhetoric of both Moscow and Washington on this occasion?
Sure. So both the Russian Air Forces and the Russian Navy have a long history of rather risky behavior, at least compared to Western militaries. So this kind of interaction is not new. I do agree with the administration that in all likelihood, this was not intentional. There were a lot of people that came online right away and said this was strategic messaging and coercion directly from President Putin. And I don't believe that. You don't direct a pilot to fly their plane into something to send a message to somebody else, because it sends a very weird message. I mean, the plane could have gone down. That doesn't send a good message from the Russian side. And so I think this is one of those cases, and I've worried about this for years, especially when I was at the White House. We had a lot of different dangerous interactions, and you worry that one of these pilots is going to do something stupid and lose an aircraft, and all of a sudden you have this unintended escalation where the Russians would claim we shot it down or what have you, and the situation can really get out of control. So it's disturbing that the Department of Defense is saying that not only has this been a historical problem, but it's actually getting worse.
Jeff, considering the overall disposition in the region militarily, was such incident just waiting to happen? And was it kind of inevitable in a sense, just seeing how the confrontation right now is presenting itself and how things are happening on the ground?
I mean, I think that the likelihood of something like this happening has increased since the war. But again, the United States was operating in an international airspace. The Russians fly jets by, the United States on a fairly regular basis. But I do think because of the increased tensions in the region, that could lead, these pilots who were probably directed to harass the UAV to be a bit more aggressive. And so I think, just given the increased amount of reconnaissance that we're performing, the increased general air activity in the region, I think that something like this was likely to happen.
So when it comes to the protocol or military protocol and what we know about it, you said that the pilots were likely directed to harass the drone. Where such directions might be coming from? And is it some kind of lower level initiative? Is it coming from the top? How does it work usually?
So I think it's difficult to say. I think you have a couple different factors there. They were probably ordered to, at a minimum, escort the UAV, right? Once they're ordered to escort, again, there's a culture within the Russian Air Forces and the Russian Navy of hot dogging, of being very coercive with both their aircraft, and their ship drivers are the same way. The ships also perform dangerous maneuvers. And so it's unclear if they were told to harass or just escort, and the escort just got out of control. Like, for example, they had shed some fuel on the UAV, like got in front of the UAV, released some fuel in an attempt to mess up the sensors. We just don't know, at least on the outside, whether or not that was directed or not.
Jeff, the Russian ambassador in Washington shared his view of the incident, and he was summoned to the State Department to give an explanation. And he said that the U.S. Drone, according to the Russian data, was collecting intelligence for the Ukrainian forces. And he also reminded of the potential of this type of drones to carry bombs on board, which was confirmed by the New York Times sources. The bombs were not there, but potentially it's possible. Do you assess these statements as accurate, first of all?
It's unclear. I don't know what, that's I'm sure it's classified. Whatever that drone was collecting was, I'm sure, classified. I don't know if that's used for, Ukraine, or if that's just for our own purposes. It's unclear, but we've been flying drones in the same area for years, right? There's nothing new here, but the Russian government does not generally recognize international barriers, right? Boundaries. That's part of the fundamental problem in all of this, is that the Russian government believes it has a privileged space. It doesn't matter if we're in international airspace. We're too close to them. And this is where you're going to likely have incidents, because we are going to keep doing this. This drone is expensive, but we have a lot of them, and we're going to keep using them. And this in a certain sense, ensures that we will keep using them, because now we can't back down, or we can't back away and suddenly not fly drones there. That would set a horrible precedent. And so this is something that I think is going to be a problem going forward.
Jeff, from the universal military standpoint and protocol, how do you usually address situations like this? You perceive something as a threat, and then what do you do? What is the safe protocol of handling things like that?
Well, in general, whenever, for example, when the Russians fly a bomber off of California or Alaska, we will, send up some aircraft to escort it in a safe way, right? Because we understand it's not illegal, and so the Russians are allowed to do it. I remember when I was on the National Security Council, I would encourage the White House to not put out statements about Russian bombers, because it's just not in a certain sense, it's playing to the Russian government's desire to really look more powerful than it actually is. And so I think there is a safe protocol that the Russians could have followed. They're in international airspace too. They could escort the drone. They could just be near it and observe it, let us know that they observe it. But the kind of hot dogging that they do with drones, they also do with aircraft that are manned, right? Like actual reconnaissance aircraft. And that can be really dangerous, because if you start losing lives over this, again, you get into this area where you have unintended escalation that could really get out of control. So there is safe protocols, and the Russians should follow them.
One detail that is being discussed right now, the drone is said to be flying with transponders being off. Do we know anything about that?
I don't know whether or not the transponders were on or off. Typically, we do fly with transponders on unless there's a military need not to. The Russian Air Force, on the other hand, has flown aircraft with their transponders off. I recall a number of years ago, a Russian Bear Foxtrot flying up the English Channel and having, commercial airplane having to divert all over the place because it did not have its transponders on. And so it's a bit silly that the Russians are accusing us of flying without our transponders on. And they clearly knew where the drone was.
Jeff, speaking about the bigger picture, how do you assess the deconfliction effort that happened in the last 2 days?
Well, I think it's good that, that my understanding is that Secretary Austin did speak with Shoigu. I think that's a good thing. I think those lines are open. Most people, don't understand that, like, it's actually quite easy for the two sides to talk if they both agree to. And I think this was a good situation where they exercised a very prudent protocol to get a hold of each other and make sure that there is an unintended escalation. I'm sure we communicated to the Russians that this was completely unacceptable. I imagine Shoigu said, well, you're operating too close to us. And so I'm sure there's no resolution there, but at least they spoke about the issue.
So in other words, there is like an element of own truth in both sides' statements. And then when we're talking about the future, you said that there is a danger of this, kind of spiraling out of control in the future. Do we see any meaningful effort to prevent that? I mean, we don't know what Shoigu and Austin discussed, but do you think there is willingness on both sides to do something meaningful about this?
Well, I think we're going to continue to do what we can legally. I mean, we are allowed to fly there, and we're going to continue to fly there. If the Russians want to fly drones off of California or Alaska, they're more than welcome to in international airspace, right? And so the safe way going forward is for the Russians to not conduct unsafe acts near U.S. platforms, whether that's in the air or on the water. That's the safe way going forward. We are not going to recognize certain areas in international airspace as special Russian areas that we can't operate in. That's just not something we're going to do. It sets a horrible precedent, not just for Russia, but for China and for just the international security realm in general. And so I think that the safe way going forward, and to your other point about there being truths on both sides, when the Russians say that we're operating too close, I mean, that's their perception, right? That's not truth in the sense legally, right? Like I said, the drone was allowed to be flying in that area. And I think we're going to continue to fly in that area, especially since the Russians have created this incident.
Jeff, we're hearing that the remains of the drone might be retrieved by the Russian side, but the American side is saying that the sensitive information was deleted in the process. How worried is Washington now about this drone ending up in the hands of the Russian military?
I don't think. I mean, obviously I think they would prefer it not to be in the Russian hands. But even if the Russians were able to get a hold of it and look at it, it's very hard to reverse engineer something that's that complicated. And even if they could understand what they were looking at, they can't produce it, right? They just don't have, especially with Western sanctions right now. So I think the threat there is rather mitigated. The other side of this is that, at least what I'm hearing from, at least what I've seen in the news from the Turkish Ministry of Defense, is that they may be letting U.S. warships in to try to recover the drones themselves. If that's the case, this is another example of where the Russian government has created the precise conditions it was trying to avoid, right? By doing something like this, they may actually be allowing U.S. warships into the Black Sea. And so it's just another example of the Russian government often being its own worst enemy.